we've been talking over the last couple of years now about worldview, and what I want to try to help us do today is I want to try to help us focus on how and why the question of worldview, or what it means to do change at the worldview level. And sometimes we try to make these conversations non-political, but it's occurred to me that the problem today is that the answer to the political questions is at the level of worldview. And we have a crisis in our country and our globe that is at the worldview level. And you will bat your head against the wall, or two people just pound their heads against each other until they get to the level of worldview, and then we can have a conversation. And what I want to try to do is look in about the next 10 minutes at what I mean by at the worldview level. And it doesn't really mean, do you know about the rest of the world? So the thing about worldview is, first of all, everybody has one, but they're very hard to know what it is. It's very hard to become self-conscious about your worldview, because your worldview is what seems natural. And so you say to yourself, well, I'm just doing regular. It's sort of like once I was in Australia, and we were going to, a group of us were going to make lunches, and so everybody, one person was going to make lunch for everybody. So we put up a sign that said, what kind of sandwich do you want? I just want a regular sandwich. Okay. Well, then a regular sandwich. But then, well, no, I don't want mustard on it. You don't put mustard on a regular sandwich. You put mayonnaise on a regular sandwich. You got to say with mustard if you want with mustard. Well, so, and you know, in Australia, Vegemite is a regular sandwich. Well, in my world, Vegemite is not a sandwich at all. That's poison. So vegetable extract, and you don't put it on like jelly. But so the point is, worldview is what's normal. Now the problem today is what's normal. What has been normal through the 20th century is no longer necessarily adequate to the 21st century. And it's at some very fundamental levels, which I'll come back to in a minute. So now, what happens, how do you know when your worldview's in trouble? Your worldview's in trouble when the things you do don't have the desired results. And that's part of the problem we have today. People are doing what they think is right, and they're having unexpected or undesirable consequences. And that's true whether it's trees are dying of pollution, or people are being kept out of the country that should be coming in, or whatever. So that's how we know we have a worldview problem, because two people who should be friends with each other disagree, and you can't prove, neither one of them can prove why they think what they want to do is correct. That means their worldviews are different. And that's what we have, that's where we have a problem. And people like you and I have got to be smart enough and bold enough and brave enough to step beyond our worldview and question at the level of worldview. And that's what these worldview salons are trying to do. And the reason that gives me hope in this is that you can see over time when worldviews have changed. They do change. But they change when people like you and I decide to step out of our comfort zone and say, well, maybe I should look at my worldview. And then finally, enough people, individual people, find each other and share their worldviews, and then it will eventually become a popular thing. But that's how worldviews change. But it takes time. And we're in an early phase of a new worldview. I'm quite convinced of that, because there's not many of us, even the ones of us who've worked together for a long time, have a hard time of saying what the new worldview looks like. We don't have good new stories. We don't have good new ways to convey. And a lot of times what happens is we use words and phrases from the old ways that get us in trouble because they get misunderstood. So I want to try to spend most of my next few minutes, oh, my watch turned sideways, trying to look at what comprises a worldview. And I think I want to look at it two ways. There's three things that a worldview, three big arenas that worldviews have to deal with. And then I want to look at how those get manifested. So the three big arenas that worldview has to deal with are cosmology, sociology, and ontology. Cosmology is how did the world get to now? And where is it going? How does the cosmos work? Sociology is, what does humanness mean? What does it mean to be a human being, and how do we get along with each other? And ontology means what is going on at the depth of life and in my interior that is beyond the rational and it usually ends up being beyond the rational and the obvious. What's the non-material? What's the divine? Those are the kinds of things that I'm trying to put in that ontology. Now, there is the work we did last year. We had those triangles. So that's the natural world, the sociology, and the interior. Now, let me just give my short reason of where I think some examples of where the problem is, and I want to. If anybody listens to this that's not sitting around this table, I'm not trying to beat up on Christians, and I'm a good Christian. So, but let me say where I think the problem is. Let's say on cosmology. We have a book that says God created heaven and earth, and in 6 days put men here, and then took a rest. And the problem, it goes on to say, and the problem is some woman ate an apple and convinced us all to sin, and now we have big problems, and if everybody would just behave, i.e. follow the rest of the rules in this book, everything would be okay. Now, that is not everybody's interpretation of the beginning of the Bible, but that is a very common way. I mean, that's what I was trying to do. That leads us to big problems. The environment, science is negated totally, and but the problem is you and I don't have another compelling story about an emerging universe that took 14 billion years to create, and we're all participating in shaping the future. We don't have a way to tell that story in a compelling way. So this is where, and a lot of the environmental people who are against, so if I'm an environmentalist and I look for people who are not on my friend list, a lot of them say, well, the environment is God's problem. And that's unfortunately not the case. Okay, enough of that. So Then on human, there's a to use a scripture line, there's a part in the scripture that says the purpose of being a human is to go forth, be fruitful, and multiply. Well, in that case, I'm a failure. And I'm not really willing to commit myself to being a total failure. And
if you need a pat on the back, I can help.
okay, good. But so we need a new story of what does it mean to be a human being in a compelling way. And it's not have a lot of stuff. It's not necessarily even make a lot more people. But we don't have a common consensus of what it means to be a human being. For my short answer to that is a human being is a creature who makes decisions about the shape of the future. That would be my answer. And then this whole HB2 bathroom bill is the problem most people have with that is my definition, a human being is a person who makes a decision about the shape of the future, is, well, God made you this way. You can't decide about that. Well, that's a tension there. We haven't worked these things through at the level of worldview. So I think we've got real hard work to do at the level of cosmology, sociology, and what is the divine? How does God work in history? My short example of that is there's the statement, God made the world, is syntactically the same as Nelson made a picture frame. The syntax of those is exactly the same. God made the world, Nelson made a picture frame, and I sometimes add my dog Tony. Tony made a friend. Now the problem is, Nelson made a picture frame is a univocal noun and a verb and a univocal noun. But God made the world is a metaphor to another metaphor. And Tony made a friend is univocal verb metaphor, because friend is a metaphor. Because it's a relational kind of thing. Well, the problem is we don't have good language. Our language gets us in trouble. And I'm not against the statement God made the world, but it has to be interpreted differently than Nelson made a picture frame. And we don't know how to do that within our language. Now, then how does worldview play out? The way worldview plays out, the way you see somebody's worldview, is it shows up in three different arenas. Their rites and rituals, the way they do things, their icons, the images that they stand before, and the myths, the stories they tell. So, rituals, icons, and myths. And the ones of us who live in an emerging reality where the human being is making decisions about the future and celebrating the glorious wonder of the universe, and God is an omnipresent reality that's using metaphorical language to describe reality. We don't have a good set of things to do to demonstrate that that's our worldview. We don't have pictures to put on our wall that remind us that that's what we're doing. What would you put on your wall to say I'm a citizen of the planet? Would you put an Earthrise, one of those Earthrise flags? But I have one of those in my room. and stories and myths. Some of you, we had Neil deGrasse Tyson came here and gave a 2-hour lecture. Unbelievable. Did you go to that?
You mean Ron Sears?
Yeah. Yeah.
We were out of town.
It was unbelievable. The guy talked for 2 hours, and it was like 10 minutes. But one,
Entertaining.
yeah, it was very entertaining. And one of the things he said, was he was talking about science and the importance of affirming science, and he was talking about evolution and the importance of affirming evolution. And somebody had done statistics on people, what percentage of people think that the human species evolved from another species. And so they went around the world, somebody went around the world on a grant, I'm sure they got a lot of money, and asked people, and so like Iceland was like 90% of the people believed that the humans evolved from another species. In the United States, we were like, and so they were ranked, we were like 50th or 47th or something. And only 40% of the people in the United States believe that the human species emerged from another species. Well, that's a big problem. In my opinion, that's a real big problem. Because that means where did we come from? But the problem is, we don't have among us, let me say, if you just say, okay, everybody here has to tell a story about how the human species got on the planet. Blah, 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 blah. We don't have a good story. I tried to write one time called Larry and Ursula's Big Decision. And it's a story about two monkeys who decided to give up swinging in the trees and stay on ground. Well, that's a story. But there's no story. I mean, you can look in every book out there, and you'll not find 2 books about how did the human species, what were the dynamics that allowed the human species to come into being on planet Earth. And the answer, a big comet fell and ice crystals, that's not how it happened. But we don't know how things change, and therefore we don't look to see how things change. So moving forward, number one, what I want to get out of this is, number one, we have a worldview crisis that affects our cosmology, our ontology, and our sociology. And it requires new rituals, icons, and myths. And until we get a new standing point, we will never be able to solve the conundrums that are facing society in the 21st century, because they were caused by a worldview that will never be able to solve them. Now, you don't necessarily have to believe that, but that is my contention. And you and I, people like you and I, are at least moderately self-conscious about the fact that this is where the problem is. And what we need, what I'm encouraging us to work on is getting this unblocked. So, and it's very difficult to become self-conscious of your worldview, and it's more difficult to create a new one because it seems like the old one should be okay. But I'm just passionate that this is the level at which we have to do our work. So we're going to reflect on this. Then what we're going to do in the workshop is look at some of the big problems and eventually begin to ask ourselves, how does changing the worldview allow us to change the way we respond? So thank you for listening. I'm done.
Good. Let's reflect a minute on what we heard.